Hello everybody, my name is Walter and this is episode 9 of my Redstone Commands Series. In this episode I want to talk about JSON Text. So what is it, what are its components and what can you do with it? Now before I actually get started, I can give you one big tip, and that is to use the online tools. Link for the one I've used myself will be in the description. Those online tools are somewhat similar to simple text editors and actually allow you to just give it the information of what you want to do with the text, and it will automatically create the JSON text for you. This episode here is mostly meant to give you an overview over all of the options you have, and also to enable you to actually read the created or generated JSON text. So if you find you want to modify a minor part here, you can do it manually. That's the main idea behind this episode. So let's start with the basics. What is JSON text? Well, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a way to give text more attributes. For example, to make it bold, a certain color, or maybe add a command that's executed every time you click on that text. That's what JSON text is all about. The general syntax of JSON text is pretty straightforward and very similar to NBT data. So you have the fancy brackets on the outside, and then you have triplets of attribute, double point, and then the value. And as you can see, the main difference to NBT data is here that the attributes and the values are strings. So text themselves in quotation marks. That's the main difference, and getting those quotation marks placed correctly is very important and can actually break JSON text very quickly if you forget them to be placed in the correct position. So that's the general syntax, and in the following I will go through the different options you have or attributes you have available to you and what they do and how you can use them. The first one is just text. This is the plain and simple text that gets displayed when you use a JSON text. So just text and then what you want to display. It's pretty much the same as if you just wrote down this simple string in quotation marks. And in situations where you have, or where the game expects a JSON text, it will automatically try to translate this here into this here. In most instances, this will work. There are some situations where it will cause an error. As an example, let's look at this sign here. So let's look at the block data of the sign, and you can see already there is JSON text in there. So you have an NBT tag for each line. This is the first line, second, third, and fourth line. And you can already see those are just plain text. In the instance of the 3 bottom lines, it's just empty text. There's nothing there. And in this part here, we have the basics, and then something strange going on here, which is required to get actually quotation marks into the text, but more about this in a few seconds. So simple text, just text. Now you can add a few more things, or there are some special cases here. The first is if you have a \n as part of the text, that will be interpreted as a line break. Now a line break only really makes sense for chat messages and books, because if you add it in a sign, it will only display the first line, and everything that comes after the line break will be simply ignored. Secondly, instead of just plain text in quotation marks, you can also just write true or false before the quotation marks, and they will be automatically translated into the corresponding string. Similarly, numbers can also be written down without the quotation marks. They would still be interpreted as a string later on. So that's text. Now you have occasionally a situation where you only want to manipulate a part of a text. So for example, to give different parts different colors, or just make part of the text bold. And there are 2 ways you can do this. The first is using a list, and the second is using childs, JSON childs. The list means that you have the rectangular brackets, and then you have a first text, and then a second text, and then maybe a third text, and so on. And what happens to the first text doesn't really apply to the second or third text. So if you add a click event to A, it will not be part of B or C. Child, on the other hand, which is deployed or used by using the extra attribute, and then the value to that is not just simple text, but a list of JSON text again. If you use this situation here, what happens to A also applies to B and C. So if you give A a click event, B and C will have the same click event unless you override it specifically. So if you want, for example, have text in different colors, but all of them should do the same if you click on it, you would use this extra attribute here. So that's text and extra. Now, before I get to further attributes, let's talk about nested JSON. So you have already seen this a bit, but may have not noticed this. The text one, for example, expects a simple string. It does not expect a JSON text, it expects a simple string. And that's where this single quotation marks come in. Because what we actually have here is a string that contains a JSON text, not JSON text directly. And if you just have two layers, like it's the case here, you can use different quotation marks. So if you have it written like this here, the computer knows, okay, the outer string goes over the whole part, and then I have two inner strings, which one is this here, and the second is this one here, and it knows what it's supposed to do. If I were to use only quotation marks, all the same, it would see, okay, the first text is here, then I have just plain text, and I don't know what to do with that. Then I have a text that's just a double point, and then directly after I have again a short text, but I can't really interpret this properly. And that's the reason they use two different quotation marks for the language of science here. And this works very fine as long as you only have two layers. But sometimes you need more layers. For example, with click events, you have to embed commands, and they can also have string as arguments. And those arguments can even be JSON text, and then it becomes more and more complex. And that's where escaping comes into the play. So escaping is done for the quotation marks and for the backslash. And basically it means every time you go a layer down, you need to add a backslash before the character you actually want to not interpret it at this point. So if you have a quotation mark and you go one layer down, you need to make it a backslash quotation mark. And if you were to go even a further layer down, you would have to not only backslash the quotation mark, but also the already existing quotation mark. So you get a triple backslash quotation mark. If you have a single backslash, you would have to make it a double backslash. If you have a double backslash, it becomes a quadruple backslash. So this can become quite confusing quickly, and this is also the main reason I would recommend using online tools when you're working with JSON text, since they make this very easy to do and help you with not getting just random garbage due to having missed a backslash somewhere or something like that. Nevertheless, there are also, again, some special cases. The first is the line break. Here you only need to escape the backslash, not the n. And the second is if you actually want to have a a quotation mark as part of the actual text, like here, you will have to add a double backslash before it. So you can see this here. We have the text, and then here the plain text starts. And here you can see, okay, it starts with an actually displayed quotation mark, then the basics, another quotation mark, and then the text part or this value here ends. So it can become a bit confusing, but once you have understood the logic behind it, it also is still readable. Nevertheless, here just a quick example. If you have a click event and there's a tellraw command in there, you can give it another JSON text, and you can see with a click event, usually you are already one layer down. And then when you go into the JSON for the tellraw, you are two layers down, and so on and so on. This can go even further. For example, you could make a tellraw command that again contains a click event that has another tell row, and you can start nesting it ad infinitum. So very, very confusing following a certain point. Nevertheless, those were the basics. Following that, let's talk about color. So if you want to change the color of a text, you will need the attribute color, and that attribute can be either set to one of 16 predefined colors or to a self-defined color. The predefined ones are black and white, gray and dark gray, red and dark red, yellow and gold, green and dark green, aqua and dark aqua, light and dark purple. You can also use reset. Reset will reset it to the default. It will also reset things like bold or italic and so. So be a bit careful with that. If you want to use your own colors, which are not among those, you can also start with a hash, and then you have a 6-long hexadecimal number. The first two letters are, or the first two digits are the red value, then you have the green value, and then you have the blue value. I would recommend using an online tool where you just select the color you want and it will automatically give you the corresponding color code. If you want to have a text with different colors like this here, you will need the whole thing as a list again. So here you have a list. The first one, the CO, has the color dark red, then you have the LO with green, and then you have the RS in blue. So pretty straightforward. Then we have further options if we want to change how the text looks like. The first thing we can change is the font of the text. So what type of letters are actually used? Minecraft comes with 3 predefined fonts. The first is default, which you can also change a bit in the menus. Then you have uniform, and then you have alt, which is the standard galactic alphabet, which some people may be able to read. I don't. Little thing to note here, this only really works for text and for numbers. Special characters like, for example, a double point just get represented by this rectangle here. We can also implement other fonts using data packs. So in that instance, you would have the data pack name and then the name of the font. You can further set, for example, the attribute bold to true. You can use either the string true, or you can just write down true. As I said, this will be interpreted properly to, well, make the text bold like I did here in the lines up there. You can also make text italic. You can make it underlined. You can make strike through, and you can obfuscate text. So this here is also a true in there, but as you can see, it's not readable. You can only see that there is some text, but you don't know what text it is. So this is maybe something for a hangman game or something like that. Now let's also quickly have a look at this sign here. So you can see in this sign here, I made the whole thing bold. I made it underlined, and well, I just gave it the normal text. So not even a different font. Up to this point, all the text we were looking at was completely passive. Now we are getting into the more interactive stuff. For example, here I have a sign, and every time I click on that sign, I get a cookie. And that's a simple click event, but there are also other types of events, and that's what I want to talk about next. So let's start with click events. There are 5 different types of click events, and they all follow a very simple and similar structure. First, we have the attribute click event. And then after the double point, we don't have just a text, but instead we have a sub-JSON with 2 sub-attributes. The first is action and the second is value. Action has 5 possible values, and well, the value more details what actually is going to happen. The first click event is the run command. This expects a valid command as the value and will execute it just as if you had entered this command in the chat console or in a command block. Now there is a bit of an inception going on here. I have actually embedded this very click event in the background of this text here. So as I said, a bit of an inception. So if I click on that, I will run a command, say hello world. And you can see I told the world hello. The next click event has the action suggest command and then a value which can be any string. It doesn't need to be a valid command. This is something that only works in chat, so I've tricked around a bit and actually sent myself, and I click on this here, a message. Well, let me quickly clean that up a bit and resend it. So what you can see here is, first of all, text. But in the background of this text, this very same click event is embedded. So again, inception going on here. So I've embedded a suggest command with a value, say hello triple point. And if I click on this text here, I get this here input into my chat window. I can change anything I want. The moment I click on this, I'm back to just the value. So this overrides anything I have in here. Now, this makes a lot of sense if you, for example, have a data pack with different difficulty levels and you want to give the player the ability to freely choose the difficulty level. So you could make a menu for that contains an option to change it to specific difficulty levels, or you just give it the player the option to change it with a single command where he can insert the level. Just an example. This obviously only works for the chat. And with that, let's get to open URL. This is something only for chat and books, doesn't work in science. And here the value should be a valid web page URL. And what happens is if I click on that, I can, if I were to press yes, open that web page in my default browser. So this is if you want to tell someone to go to a specific web page, a guide, or maybe a page on the wiki for his question. Then we have copy to clipboard. This is pretty straightforward. You click on it. Again, inception going on. I have embedded a corresponding click event in the background. And now if I open the chat and press Ctrl V, I have inserted it in here or pasted it in there and can do this a few more times if I want. So that's that. And the last click event is change page to a number. And that's something that only works in books. And as the name implies, you can change the page to a corresponding number. So here I would directly jump to page number 4. And there we are. Don't even need, as I said, to write a number as a string. It will automatically be interpreted correspondingly. So that's the click events. Insertion works very similar to suggest command. It's also only for the chat. But there are also some differences because it's just an attribute you give normal text. So again, this is embedded in the background. I will send myself a message that contains the click here as plain text and an insertion you clicked. So I'm doing that. And you can see I have a click here. Now, if I just click there, nothing will happen until I shift click. So I press the shift key and click. In that moment, I'm inserting what I had as an insertion in the background into my chat window. So similar to the suggest command, but an insertion and not an override. And you also need to shift click. And the last type of event are hover events. There are multiple types, but the two important ones are show text and show item. So similarly to before, we have hover event, and then we have action and contents as sub-attributes. Action show text will just show the text that is part of contents or the value to the sub-attribute contents. You could even use JSON text again in here and, for example, color this text. but this is just to give a little pop-up help message or something like that. A bit more interesting is the show item, where as content you need to define an item. And if you go on that, this is the same as if you were looking at that item in your inventory. So you can use this, for example, to display a quest reward for the player so he knows if the quest is even worth doing it. And those are the events. Now let's nevertheless have a quick look at this sign here. So we have data, we have block, and we can see here inside of the sign, first line, we have embedded a click event with run command and give the nearest player one cookie. Sometimes you have a situation where you want to display data that changes over time as part of a text, for example, on a sign. And here there are multiple things you can actually display directly using JSON syntax. As an example, I have a sign here with an embedded click event that will actually check the nearest entity and write its name into the fourth line here. So at the moment, that's obviously me. If I were to throw this stairs at it, and if I'm not too slow, it will detect the stairs. If I get further away, it should, well, at some point it would detect also this armor stand over there, but let's just throw a pillar at it, and you can see it detects the pillar. And once that is out of the way, it will detect myself again. So that's something you can do, and there are many things you can do here. So the first thing you can display are scoreboard objectives. By the way, this will not work as part of hover events, but besides of that, it will simply work. The syntax is you start with the attribute score, and then below that, similar to click events, for example, you have again a sub-JSON with one attribute being objective and the second being name. You can also add a third, which is value, but that would actually override what you actually want to display, so I don't see any reason to use it. So I will not talk about this anymore. Anyway, let's talk about this example here. Again, inception going on. If I click on this, what this here would represent is actually shown in the chat window. So let's show what this is. So we have a score. We want to display the objective brush menu, which I have due to a data pack I'm running in the background. And the name specifies which entity I'm talking about. And well, I'm talking about the nearest player, which is, well, me. Another option would be, for example, using the multiplication sign. Because if I use this, this means that every player, if I send this message as part of a message to every player would see their own value for this. So rather interesting little feature there, and not widely known, I believe. Anyway, let's click on it, and you can see we have a 0 in there. And that's actually the value for this objective as it should be. So that's scoreboard objectives. Next, we have NBT data. So NBT data is a flat structure. You have the attributes NBT, then you have either block, entity, or storage. Then you have optionally interpreted and separator. NBT defines the path of the NBT data you want to look at. Block, entity, or storage defines the block entity, the normal entity, or the storage you want to look at. Interpret is optional, and if set to true, will try to interpret whatever you get back from your NBT data as JSON text. I will show you an example just in a few seconds. And separator defines how you want to separate your list if that NBT can apply or gives you several results at the same time. For example, if you select for multiple entities or something like that. The default is a black comma, I believe. Anyway, Simple example you can see here. So NBT, I'm looking at inventory. I'm further specifying I want to see the first slot. And I want to know the count of that slot. So basically, I want to know how many items are in the first item slot. And the entity I'm looking at is the nearest player. So again, inception, I'm clicking on this and I'm getting back. Now at the moment I'm getting back nothing because I don't have anything in there. If I get an item, you can see 1b means 1 in byte type, which is just a numeric type. If I get a full inventory in there, now I get 64. That's that. Now I promised you another example. And for this, I prepared two little commands that are looking just at this top line here. So this first will look at the NBT text 1 of the block at those coordinates here. And what I get back is this whole thing here. So I have an embedded click event and I have a text 4 in there with a selector going on and feedback text. So bit confusing, but if instead I add interpret true, I only get what I actually see on the sign. Now, if I were to click on that, I would actually be able to trigger a click event. Now, well, since I'm not in the correct position, yeah, there is nothing going on here, but you get the idea. So the interpret can be useful if you're working, for example, with signs, and you just want to know what's on the sign, actually. Next, you can also list entities, which is, by the way, what I used for this sign here. So the two attributes are selector and separator. Selector is just an entity selector or target selector and or has a target selector as a value. You could also use an ID of an entity if you want. And separator defines, if you find more than one, what text you want in between those. For this example here, I'm checking for all entities within 20 blocks. And as a selector, I want a pipe in gold. And well, I click on that. Again, inception going on. The same is embedded in the background of the JSON. And you can see I get a list of the stuff that's around me. So some item frames, myself, and a few armor stands. And you even get some nice hover events going on here. And there are also some insertions in the background. So there is a lot of things happening in the background when you're using this selector. You will also see this if I use the data command to have a look at this sign here. So you can see all of the magic is happening in the first text. So here I have the click event. You already saw this earlier bit. The first line has a click event, which runs a command, data merge, which overrides the fourth text with a selector and, well, some additional text. And here the fourth, all of that here was more or less automatically inserted through the selector. So I have an insertion, I have a hover event, and I have a name which already uses a translate function, which comes in a few seconds. And all of that is automatically generated here. This brings me to the fourth type of insertion or input here, which is translations. Now, the two attributes are translate and with. Now, I've never used translations, and I don't really understand exactly how they work. So I won't try to do an explanation here that will likely be faulty. So instead, if you are interested in this, I would recommend looking in the Wikipedia and maybe reading up in some forums or Reddit or somewhere else. I won't cover it any further in this episode here. And that brings me to the last type what you can do here. That is, you can figure out what key is actually bound to a function. Since those are configurable in the options menu, this might be interesting for some reasons if you want to tell the player to press a certain button to get a certain effect. If you want to build a tutorial, for example. The keyword here is key bind. And the value is a string that you can also find in the options point text file that is in your Minecraft folder. And if you use this, again, inception going on, well, obviously or apparently I've keyed or bound the E key to the inventory. And that's all of the feedback mechanisms. Now that we've talked about JSON text for quite some time, it's time to talk about where you can actually use it. So let's talk about the chat, signs, and written books. When you're putting JSON text into the chat, you're usually using the tellraw command. So the tellraw command I will explain a bit more in detail at a later point, but it's a command that actually expects JSON text. So let's go with a simple text and maybe let's make it bold. Very quickly, very dirty, and now we have a bold hello. So that can be used in combination with JSON text to make your messages a bit more interesting. You can even add, using JSON lists, more than just one message or one command, embedded command, run command, into a single chat message. The main limitation here is the manual chat only allows for a maximum of 256 characters in your chat window. Everything beyond that will be simply cut off and ignored. Well, you won't be able to actually add more text to the chat window. That's quite a problem when you're working with JSON text, because depending on what you want to do, this JSON text can be quite a bit longer than 256 characters. For example, if you're working with books, they can be easily thousands of characters long. So how can you get around this? Well, a simple workaround is using the function command. So you make a data pack. Inside of this data pack, you put a function, and inside of that function is the actual, for example, tellraw command with the very, very long string after it, or JSON text after it. And here, as part of a function in a data pack, there is no max length, at least as far as I know. So you can then use the function command to trigger that function in your data pack and subsequently get that message out. So you can easily build chat menus which would not be able to insert via manual tellraw command, but can be triggered as part of a data pack. So here I have a very simple chat menu that allows me to give myself a command block or a start chat block, or trigger the highest menu of the data pack I'm running in the background. So can be quite useful if you want to have interactive data packs. Next up, we have signs. Now, signs are interesting because they allow you to embed exactly one command per line. So up to 4 commands in total, and they are all executed at the same time, or one after the other sequentially, if you click on the sign anywhere. So here I have 4 commands embedded, and you can see I get 4 commands executed no matter where I click on it. You can already write very small and primitive programs with that, but if you need more, again, you need the function command, or if you want, you can also use the trigger command to trigger a data pack function that's running in the background. If you're using signs with an embedded run command, then those commands are executed as if a command block was used, with the sole exception being that the player clicking on that sign actually is selected for the self-selector, but not the position. So what this means is, for one, the slash in the front of the command is optional. And for the other, if you use this type of notation, you would get the same result as if you use the tilde notation. Those are the main differences. And also, if you use the self-selector, you will get the player who is clicking on it. So if you want to tell everyone player, whoever clicked on that sign, although he was forbidden, then you can do this now. And what can you do with that? Well, you can do things like score displays or game controls or teleportation signs and many other things. So I've showed you already a simple example here which determines the nearest entity. Or here I have an entity counter. So let's actually throw an entity somewhere and click on that, and you can see the count has increased by 1. If I throw another one, it will increase further until they reach the void and will despawn again. And well, let's actually have a look at the data in there. So you can see what I've done there. So text 4 you can for now completely ignore because that is set by a previous command. Let's start with text 1. So the first thing that happens is I run a command that creates an objective temp counter. And also I set the text. Text 2 contains a click event that will check how many entities are around and will write this into the temp counter of the nearest player. Number 3 will then take that value and write it into the 4th line of the sign, and will also additionally add a click event in the background of the 4th line that will again delete the objective. So I'm cleaning up behind myself, or the sign is cleaning up behind itself. And then the 4th one is, well, created by the 3rd one and basically just contains the number and the run command to clean up in the background. So that's what's going on in this sign. And that brings me to the last one, which are written books. Now, written books are interesting because they allow you to put a lot of commands into a simple package. A written book, in the Java edition at least, can have between 1 and 100 pages. Each page has 14 lines, and depending on how many or what type of letters you're using, you can have around 25 letters per line. So loads and loads of options to add functionality as, for example, click events. And what can you do with that? Well, here's just a little example. So I've written a book here that actually allows you to modify the nearest armor stand. So you can make it small, or you can remove the base plate, or add some arms, or reverse all of that if you want, and do loads and loads of this stuff here. So that can be quite powerful to give even novice players the ability to, for example, customize the posture of armor stands for role-playing and maybe the storefronts and whatever. And with that, we have reached the end of this episode about JSON text and its uses. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and well, see ya.